Like, nobody wants to marry Bonnie Blue. If that is what you believe, why would you want to do that to your future spouse?
If you buy into that belief system and then you can't find someone to have sex with you, so you're, say, an incel, that's when you're going to start developing an unhealthy fixation, and it's going to start manifesting itself in an unhealthy way.
He's a kind of a blue-pilled, midwit, centrist boomer who doesn't even really know what he believes. You think I'm an idiot?
Yeah, I think you're a moron.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Long Game Podcast with myself, Ben Scallon, and my esteemed co-host, Jason Osborne, who is back in Ireland from the significantly worse country of Poland, which he now calls his home. Do you feel the Celtic blood coursing through your veins once again?
I do. There's nothing to get it flowing like a walk up O'Connell Street as I did on my way to the office. And I did have the observation for you. I asked, and we subsequently came to the conclusion that we don't know why this is on my walk up. Why the spire has defense mechanisms around it now. Like it's got like this barricade around the base of it now.
The spire has its own iron dome that you can't see, but it's only deployed in like emergency situations.
It's absolutely bizarre. I mean, I want to know what was going on at the base of the spire, essentially. I mean, I'm sure maybe I can Google it and find out, but it just seemed bizarre to me as I was walking up. Because it obviously doesn't cover the whole spire, because that would be the sort of thing we'd have ripped in the past.
Yeah.
So covered the whole spire in a barricade. But I do really want to know why they've covered the base. I mean, what is it that people are doing down there that's so heinous?
I think the spire is like the only mechanism we have for air defense in this country, just hoping that they
turn off the light to the light at the top of it and hope someone will fly into it.
That's about it. That's our national defense strategy in a nutshell.
They should have made the spire flexible. It could have whiffed around, defended the skies over Dublin.
So on that absurd note, I suppose we'll intercept the whining of the audience who don't like it when we show
some of the audience.
No, it's a lot of them. They don't like it when we show any semblance of humanity or riffing. I'd say they're great fun at parties if, like, you know, they on the work call, if somebody starts talking about how they got a new dog, they're like, listen, we're here to do a job. So anyway, with that said, we will launch into our first topic of the day, and that is the topic of whether or not it is embarrassing as a young man to wait until marriage to engage in relations with a woman. Because this topic came up when the far-right American commentator Nick Fuentes was interviewed by Piers Morgan, who claims to be Catholic. Morgan says, "Oh yeah, I'm a Catholic person," and of course, as we know, if you are Catholic, and indeed many religions have the same rule, by the way. This is not some kind of the rule that is unique to the Catholic faith. Protestants would feel the same way. Muslims would feel the same way. Jews would feel the same way. That it is discouraged and considered to be illicit for individuals to engage in relations outside the sacrament of marriage. And so Fuentes, for all his many faults and many things you could criticize him for, I certainly would criticize him for a whole variety of things and do not endorse his broader platform. He said during the interview, it came up that he is waiting until marriage. He's 27 years old and he doesn't partake of that stuff. And so this sparked Piers Morgan and a whole host of other people mercilessly mocking and deriding him for this as if it made him some kind of loser. And so I don't particularly want to talk about Nick, because I don't particularly care or think his platform is very relevant in this country. But I did want to talk about the broader phenomenon of making fun of somebody for making that particular lifestyle and values choice, because Morgan is a liberal, and we all know that if you were to say to a liberal like Morgan, you know, I have bisexual orgies every week, and I have an OnlyFans, and I've been divorced 4 times, he would have nothing to say to that. He wouldn't criticize you. He wouldn't make fun of you. He'd say, well, look, that's your life. What you do in the bedroom is your own business, and it's nothing to do with me. But if you tell him, yeah, I have traditional values, and I believe in waiting until marriage, he'll go in on you with all the ferocity of like a comically petty bully from a 90s movie. And I don't know, I just think that attitude is very instructive in as to how society views certain lifestyle choices that young people, a minority of young people, choose to make.
Yeah, well, I did that. This is one, I think it gets to something very primal for both men and women. And this is one that I think Jordan Peterson was quite good on, because he spoke about how one of the most damaging things a person can experience is, and obviously it's not a unique insight to Jordan Peterson, but he obviously spoke about this on a large stage, was being rejected by the other sex. And that's why I think people, when they're arguing with those they disagree with, so frequently hone in on this particular point, like say the incel point in particular, the involuntary celibate, which is someone who would like to be having sex but isn't able to because no one of the opposite sex is interested. And so that's why that seems to be why it's perennial, is because that sort of deep anxiety isn't going to go away anytime soon. But it's obviously a broader question as to whether we should be making fun of that or whether we should be honing in on it. And there is a lot to it. I mean, so yeah, you and I are both Catholic, as you've outlined at the beginning. You don't have to be Catholic, obviously, just sort of hold this view. A lot of the religions of the world do, but we're obviously depending that sex should be kept for marriage, and there's a whole load of reasons for that. Not least, because it's just crazy to me that the modern world has forgotten. And I say the modern world, I mean, this is the sort of thing that's been forgotten throughout history and ignored throughout history, that sex is an extraordinarily powerful force, and if it isn't properly channeled, you're looking at it sort of wreaking havoc in society in various ways. And I would say you are seeing that now. I mean, you sort of see, rising divorce rates and whatever people want to think about that. I mean, there are victims to that trend. You're seeing soaring rates of like STIs and things like that. You're seeing the rise of like, obviously, pornography culture, nearly, to put it that way, with like the latest manifestation of that being OnlyFans. And I think each of these things is a topic you could speak about in and of itself, but these are all, in my opinion, very, very bad things.
I mean, like, sorry to interrupt you, and I do want to let you finish your point, but just to say, like, I have a friend who's not religious at all. He's a total atheist, and he was saying how he had come to the conclusion that promiscuity, even as a man, is not great. And his argument was, from a purely secular perspective, he goes, I wouldn't want to marry a woman who had a high body count, as they say, quote unquote. I don't like that phraseology, but that was the term he used, because he said like nobody wants to marry Bonnie Blue. So, and I think most people intuitively agree with that and understand that. So if that's the case, if that is what you believe, why would you want to do that to your future spouse? You know, and so he had come to this conclusion without invoking God or the Bible or any religious text. He just thought about it and realized, yeah, you know what, I probably shouldn't be running around whoring myself out like a maniac. Yeah. And so it's something that you can kind of just think your way to without even having to invoke religious values. But sorry, you were saying?
No, I was just saying that I do think there's, and that's a valid point, I do think there's levels to this, which is that I do think there's a difference, say, between, say, being an incel, for want of a better way of putting it, which is that you'd love to be having sex before marriage, but you just can't find someone who will do it with you, which, funny enough, is a sign of like sort of a lack of attractiveness to the opposite sex. I mean, I don't know how else to phrase that, which means there are certain things you can probably work on as a person to make you more attractive to the opposite sex. I would nearly say that's a different phenomenon. I think effects wise, I would say it's still good for like that person not to be going around having sex, say. But I think that that's a very different thing to choosing not to have sex because you're waiting for marriage, essentially, or because you want to do things in a sort of way that gels with the wisdom of the ages, for want of a better way of putting it. And I do think that, you know, the funny thing with Nick Fuentes is that there are so many grounds you could justifiably go after him on. And I don't care, say, that Nazism is coming back into vogue. And it is funny because like saying something like that kind of makes you sort of out of touch with the modern right. And it's like, well, if that puts you out of touch with the modern right, then you don't particularly want to be in vogue with them. Although I do think that's a much smaller niche than people normally give it credit for. But anyway, like he says Hitler is cool. He says all sorts of things that are kind of like edgy and becoming popular to say again, that I think are like clearly morally disastrous, and particularly for a Catholic to be saying these things. I don't know which priest or diocese he's in or anything like that, but if they're familiar with his platform and profile, they really should be pulling him up on these things. But
yeah, that's the thing. And sorry, I feel like one of the reasons why Piers in that interview got destroyed, and he clearly did lose that debate in a very catastrophic way. I think one of the reasons is he's a kind of a blue-pilled midwit centrist boomer who doesn't even really know what he believes. Like as a Catholic, I know what I believe and you know what you believe, and there's like thousands of years of thought and teaching that have gone into the principles that you espouse, from which you can then criticize communism, fascism, any of these ideologies that are totally disastrous for society, but you know why you object to it, and it's all like it all flows into each other.
You've got a tradition you can borrow from, whereas like most modern people don't have a tradition they can borrow from. Like I think Piers Morgan's a prime example of that. It's like I understand he says he's a Catholic himself, and it's like, well, if he were borrowing from the Catholic tradition then or relying on it, he wouldn't be going after Nick Fuentes because on the basis of the fact that he hasn't had sex yet. But it is just to say then that it's obviously a very different thing if you are, again, choosing not to have it because you're, you know, according to your beliefs, your Catholic faith in this instance. And I think that, yeah, this is actually a self-destructive way to go after someone like Nick Fuentes, because a lot of people rightly see through the sort of cheap thrill of sleeping around and losing your virginity. But like, it's funny, that phrase even feels so early 2000s, like late 90s at this stage. Like, as you say, people across the board, even my friends who aren't Catholic, no one talks about that as something to be aspired to anymore. Like, people are concerned with much more basic things like getting an apartment, getting a house and things like that. Never mind losing your virginity or whatever. So I think it just sort of indicates how completely out of touch you are to sort of go after him on that basis, and to use it as an insult as well. It's like, go after him for any number of like horrendous things that he does say. But that's in my opinion not one of them. Like,
yeah, and I think as well it exposes the fact that a lot of these older people, who are typically the people who will level that kind of a criticism, don't understand Generation Z and the context in which we've grown up, because we're a generation, like I'm 28 years old, you're
29. I actually think I was the last year of the millennials. Although that's obviously like a subjective thing, but I do think 1996 is generally regarded like the last year of the millennials. So I don't. But I can fit into Gen Z for the purposes of the podcast.
Like we're a generation that grew up where most people, the vast majority of our peers, including ourselves, you could access hardcore adult material from the age of like 9 because the internet was exploding. And I don't even want to fully blame people's parents. Of course you could and you should, to a certain extent, say, look, parents have culpability here. But at the same time,
there was kind of an unprecedented proliferation, like at the same time.
Yeah, it's like a new thing. It's a new technology. Older people don't understand technology fully. And if you said to a lot of people's parents back then, 20 years ago or whatever, hey, you should probably think about putting some kind of blockers on your internet to stop your kid, they'd be like, they wouldn't even know what you were talking about, really. So, I want to be charitable in my criticism. But the point is, you have guys going around, and women as well, who were absolutely destroyed by the end stage, the late stage sexual revolution. And, so then you have these kind of like former free love hippie idiots of their parents' generation who are telling them like, oh yeah, remember having sex is cool and don't you want to be cool and all this kind of thing. And it's like, I've seen where your idiotic worldview has led. I've directly suffered because of it. And I want whatever the exact opposite of that is. I am now sprinting to the nearest church at a rate of knots because your worldview has so utterly failed me. And so, but the failure to understand that is why they have such an out of touch view of younger people and their values and what they think younger people value compared to what they actually do care about.
Yeah, and I do. There's some obvious nuance to this as well, in that, you know, if you accept that distinction, that there's a difference in terms of motives, like you're just not having sex before marriage because no one of the opposite sex finds you attractive enough to have sex, but you would if you could, and then choosing not to do so out of, you know, according to your belief system. But then it's also the case that, you know, we've got the sort of trend in general that Gen Z are having less sex than previous generations before. And I would say there's some pros to that, obviously. Like, if you're not having sex, it's not going to be a soaring rate of STIs, just to use one example. But at the same time, it's nuanced, because most of these people, most of them, there are clearly some who would be choosing it for, say, I would say virtuous reasons, choosing not to. But then there are many who would be doing it just because, I don't know how to put it, a lack of vitality amongst their generation or something like this, and that most of them, it's because they're not out meeting members of the opposite sex. They're sitting at home.
They're watching anime
or watching porn, watching, you know, playing video games and things like that. And it's like, well, that's not particularly healthy either. So there is, a lot of...
Yeah, frankly, given the two, obviously you would rather they did neither, but given the two options, playing, Rocket League all day or going around... It's hard to say which is worse, but I feel like one of them is kind of like trad degeneracy, if you want to put it that way, like return to tradition, back when the worst thing people did was like gambling and drinking too much, you know, or as opposed to taking fentanyl and watching
being online with the boys until 5 a.m.
Yeah, AI generated whatever, like, yeah, so it's all bad is the bottom line.
Yeah, no, it is, but I think it's all dire. But again, I think what we want to get back to here is that if someone is choosing not to do it, because as I say, people always think you're sort of virtue signaling when you do this. I do think that Nick Fuentes is and I use the words that, like, I find so distasteful so often on the internet. I do feel like he's a sort of toxic influence on the internet. I don't know how else to put it. He says he's got a huge platform. There's obviously debates ongoing as to how artificially that's boosted. Even like people on the right, like
I don't think it's artificial.
I think some of it. There was a study only came out there a couple of days ago about how, like, a lot of his posts are boosted by accounts based in like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and things like that.
I think if you watch him speak, I don't think it's hard to see why somebody like that would end up being very popular. He's entertaining. He's clearly high IQ. None of this is an endorsement of him, because I do not endorse him, because as you've said, like, I think many of his views are unconscionable and you can't support that. But I think when people say, oh, it's all bot, I know you're not saying that, but when people go, oh, it's all bots and they're all just astroturfing him and all this kind of thing, I think it's like, that's cope, frankly, and people try to explain away a phenomenon that they don't like.
No, I know what you mean, but I just think reality is just complicated. Just on the level of talent, he's an insanely talented streamer. Like, he's really, and I see it how just doing my basic little Wednesday live stream. It is very tough to just speak off the cuff, and like his streams are a couple hours long now. A lot of it is sort of like just blank space with music and quotes and clips coming up and things like that. But he's often like streaming for like 2 hours or so. And he's extraordinarily talented to be able to do that off the cuff and remain engaging. And he is genuinely funny in many ways. But I think, you know, that can be the case, and he can have a high level of organic popularity, and he can also be artificially boosted in some ways, because I mean, I do think that we live in a really interesting, complex world where, for whatever reason, some people are buying out bot farms in cheap countries and boosting posts and things that way. And as I say, these are people who are like, the study was posted by, I can't remember who it was now, it was shared on X, which generated the conversation by someone who's like, say, really gender ideology critical and things like that. So it's someone who isn't like, you know, woke, for want of a better way of putting it, just targeting Nick Fuentes, but saying, well, this seems interesting that this phenomena is going on and boosting his content. But it's all just to say that, you know, there's many grounds you can attack him on, but like choosing not to have sex because, you know, that's a valid aspect of the Catholic faith that he's choosing to adhere to. That's not one of them. Like, you should be going after the things that everyone of goodwill is able to tell you is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like not that it matters, not to like personalize the argument because there's no point in doing that. But for what it's worth, I waited until marriage. You know, I got married shortly before my 25th birthday. So I was 24 when I got married. I waited. My wife is the only woman I've ever been with, and I fully expect and intend to make that the case until the day I die. You know, and I think the only reason I say that, because it's none of anybody's business, you know, that I don't have to share that with people. And I was like, do I even want to, because I wrote an article about this last week, and I was like, do I even want to mention this and put this out there, given that it is nobody's business and it's a piece of personal information? And I kind of want to give an example, or I think it's good if there are more examples in society of people who give young men that as an option that they may not even have considered. You know what I mean? Because it's a very weird, or it's a very unusual.
It is taboo. Like, people don't feel comfortable talking about that, and it's like, well, you absolutely should. I mean, it's a good thing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like, because I'm not remotely embarrassed about it. And I feel like there's guys out there who would feel like a young guy who might be watching this, who maybe he feels like that's the right thing to do, but he doesn't know if you know, it's so alien. I guess it's good to remind people that this is a thing that people do, and that it is completely acceptable to make that choice, and not only acceptable, I would say good and to be encouraged. But yeah, you know, yeah, I don't regret it for 1 second. In fact, I would quite regret the opposite. I feel like it's the kind of thing that, you know, you're never going to feel bad and say, oh man, like I wish my wife, who I love, was only one of 1,000 people that I've been with in my life. You know what I mean? Like,
a lot of this also goes back to like bunk science, though, where they're like, oh, but if you're not having frequent sex come a certain age, you're going to have repressed sexuality and things like that, which will manifest itself in all sorts of unhealthy ways. And it's like, it's not how it works. It's like, okay. Well, the funny thing is, it's if you buy into that belief system and then you can't find someone to have sex with you, so you're, say, an incel, that's when you're going to start developing an unhealthy fixation, and it's going to start manifesting itself in an unhealthy way. Whereas if you're someone who understands this is completely normal, and indeed that it's a good thing to aspire to until you're married, no problems, you know. It's absolutely, like, it's the sort of thing that people have done for forever and live perfectly healthy lives in doing so, or say healthier lives in doing so. So no, I think normalizing it is good. And I do think that there's a bit of a resurgence in that. I see more people talking about these things on podcasts and on social media, and indeed even in conversations with friends and things like that. A lot of the if ever there were fruits of the sexual revolution, say, let's say rotten fruits, they've kind of run their course at this stage. Like, people, I feel like to like boomers and people a couple of generations ago were like, oh man, you can have sex with whoever you want, and they were kind of dazzled by it. And at this stage, people are just like, yeah, and life is still shit anyway.
And by the way, like, it's all highly overrated, and you know that, like, you know, when you think in your head of people running around having orgies, you picture, like, you know, very attractive people or whatever. Like, they're all ugly. Like, that's the bottom line. Not that's the point, but it is just an incidental fact that when you look, have you ever seen a polyamorous couple who you thought, wow, they look great together? Like, it's not real. So that's just a side note.
Heard it here first. All the orgies are full of ugly.
If you're polyamorous, you're ugly. That's the official line of this podcast. No, I'm joking, but I'm not, honestly. So yeah, like, none of these things are ever as good as they seem like they are. Like, this is a very small example, but I've always thought how, like, you know, you picture in your head, or you'll see like a scene in a movie of like somebody going out to a club and they pick somebody up and they go back for like a one night stand. You both stink because you've been out in like a hot club with like 1,000 human bodies sweating. So you reek. Your breath smells like handled change. You're drunk and like you're slurring your speech. And in the morning, like it's never as good as you think it's going to be based on the actual mechanics when you start thinking about the practicalities of how these things work, you know. Yeah. So as the efficiency maxer, as the interval timer maxer, I have to think about the granular details that go into these things.
Yeah, I mean,
it always demystifies
as the efficiency maxer, your bottom line is just such a waste of time. I mean, you could be sitting at home looking at analytics and that
exactly.
time.
Yeah, that whole time you could have been looking at YouTube Studio, and you just wasted it by having sex. Like that's where you went wrong.
You could have been doing a productive form of grinding.
So with that said, I suppose that kind of dovetails with another topic that we wanted to touch on, which is age verification on social media, because the Irish government and also, incidentally, the Australian government are talking about bringing in legally mandated age verification for social media companies, presumably adult companies that produce adult content online for over 18s, that, you know, you would have to prove who you are. Because we all know, everybody watching this knows, when you go on to one of these websites, it says, are you over 18? And you're 12, and you click, yes, I am. And then you get in, and you're seeing all kinds of things that you shouldn't be allowed to see. And there's no follow-up or verification. It's like, you know, that meme of the bouncer who's checking people at the event and he's like barely touching them. It's that. So the government, the Irish government and the Australian government is saying this needs to stop. And I think the Australian government are also going to ban under 16s from joining social media altogether. And you have a lot of people who are freaking out and going, oh my gosh, this is digital ID. Because, of course, in order for them to verify your age, they have to verify who you are, which means
giving your personal details and things.
Yeah, you have. So it basically ends anonymity online. That just won't be a thing because you have to be able to identify yourself. So there's all these like civil liberties concerns and all this kind of thing. I don't care. I support this 100%. And the reason I support this 100%, and I think you might disagree on civil liberties grounds, but the reason I support this 100% is because the devastation that is being done to young people because of some of the issues that we just touched on in the last topic is catastrophic. This is just like a vignette, all right? Like this is one example of like a million you could give. And I'm sure many people watching this have had similar experiences where I have a distinct memory of being at the back of the school bus when I was like 11, and there were a load of guys, and one of them had his phone, and he had a cartel chainsaw beheading video.
The stuff I saw as well when I was in school.
Oh, guys, look at this video of a guy getting blown up with a landmine or something. Things that nobody should see, let alone like an 11-year-old. Now, I actually didn't look in that instance. I had the sense to be like, yeah, I don't.
Once you sat there like this,
yeah, crying. No, but like you know, I think if you're sensible, you recognize that you can always see something, but you can never unsee something. But the point is, there's nothing stopping young people from accessing, you know, pornography, extremely graphic and grotesque niche pornography at that, violence, gore, just like the worst stuff you can imagine, everything on the internet, and or being groomed on social media by some creepy old guy. Yeah, on literally though, like it's a joke, but yeah, like, or Club Penguin is the OG version of that. But like, or, you know, even this sounds like a little bit more benign, but I think it's almost as bad in some ways, is just posting really stupid stuff as a kid, because we're all dumb when we're young, that's then on the internet forever. Something that you posted when you're 14 that then follows you for the rest of your life because you just shouldn't have said that, or you shouldn't have revealed that, or whatever. And, you know, the pushback you get when you make this argument and you say this needs to stop is people go, well, that's a job for parents. You know, we shouldn't have the government involved in regulating that. If parents are going to be irresponsible, that's their problem. Sub out social media in that argument for alcohol or cigarettes, and it is exactly as valid or invalid an argument. You know, if you say like, oh yeah, well look, just let kids drink, and, you know, parents should just be responsible and not let their 10-year-old child drink alcohol. You would never say that. That's clearly ludicrous. And this is a new emerging technology. It's only about 20 years old that the internet, I know the internet is older than that, but it's, as we know it, being used for the kinds of things it's currently being used for, social media and so on. It's a very new phenomenon. And like any technology, if it's misused, it's disastrous. You know, you can use nuclear power to generate energy for your entire city, or you can use it to make hydrogen bombs and incinerate millions of people. So the misuse of it is so bad that I absolutely support this kind of regulation. And I think that it's totally, the trade-offs, which absolutely exist, are worth it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to play. I mean, I probably do have. I'm not as unhesitating in terms of, say, support for it. We'll probably play up the disagreement somewhat for the purpose of a podcast, because I fully get where you're coming from, and I fully. It's one area that
No, you don't. Do you think I'm an idiot?
Yeah, I actually think you're a moron.
Yeah,
I do have sympathy for legislators, because I do think, as you say, this is an emerging technology, and these are the kind of things that have to be responded to, obviously, in real time, and that's very difficult to do, especially with this, because I also have I think kids are seeing things online that, as you say, you can't unsee. I mean, I'm much like yourself. You're saying there were kids being showing each other these videos around the back of the bus and things like that. I'll never forget being in school and, yeah, like in the class, someone passing around their phone, and there was this bizarre video that was going around of, I don't know what this was to this day, but it was clearly some Middle Eastern country, and they had tied a machete to a rope and they were swinging it around, whacking themselves on the back and things like this. And naturally it was grotesque and really graphic. And we were all, like, I don't know, 14 or 15 at the time or something like that. But again, I can remember it to this day, and it's the kind of thing that could have been prevented. And people would be like, oh, big deal. You saw a nasty video, just get over it. And it's like, well, I actually do think we should be, preserving innocence as long as we can, to put it that way. I do think that's a worthwhile goal. Until obviously adulthood, say, when people can, choose for themselves to do things that are bad for them. But yeah, okay, to get into the disagreement side of it, I fully get where you're coming from and where, say, governments are coming from in terms of wanting to regulate it. But as we've spoken about in regards to free speech and free expression before, I don't trust the current crop of legislators across the board ability to just leave it at protecting kids online. I think there's a constant overcreep in terms of, what this is going to be used for. I have a good example up here on my laptop, because I saw it just the other day on social media. Some of our listeners might be familiar with Ed West. I'm not sure if you know him online, Ben, sort of British commentator who put up an article censored in Britain on his Substack. He's got a very popular Substack. And he says, thanks to the Online Safety Act, which is sort of their age restriction. So the Online Safety Act was introduced in the UK with the express purpose of making the internet safer, especially for children, by placing, like, duties and obligations on tech providers and tech platforms to remove illegal content like child sexual abuse and terrorism and different things. But obviously, Ed West's Substack isn't home to child sexual abuse, and it isn't home to terrorism or anything like that. He writes really interesting articles about a whole range of topics, many of which I suppose would be considered politically incorrect. Immigration, the sexual revolution, like we've been talking about. But he was saying anyway that thanks to the Online Safety Act, some of the visitors to his site are being restricted from viewing the chat feature without going through age verification. It's also the case that some of his articles are being blocked with age-restricted content where people have to verify their age before going through, which, as I said, essentially ends anonymity on the internet, because people have to put in their personal details and things if they want to read an article, say, or engage with something that Ed West has put up, which that has nothing to do with children. That has nothing to do with keeping children safe online. You would say this has a lot more to do with blocking access to content that's sort of deemed illegal by, or potentially illegal by, governments that seem to be continuously expanding the definition of illegal or unacceptable content online. I mean, I keep going back to it. We spoke about it on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. That German NGO Hate Aid, because I think they're cutting edge in this regard, but I do think that they are instructive of the sort of spirit behind these things and of where things are going. They get huge amounts of federal funding in Germany. They also get sort of private support from foundations and philanthropies and things like that. They are trusted flaggers according to the European Union's Digital Services Act, which sort of plays a similar role, I suppose, as regards providing a sort of safe framework on the internet and things like that. And it's also the framework through which they're sort of rolling out a lot of the sort of, they don't call it this, but it is what it is, content moderation measures and things like that. But these people at Hate Aid, who obviously, because they're a trusted flag organization, when they raise an issue with content online, their concern is going to be taken a lot more seriously than like your average Joes on the internet. They think that hate online, or what they call digital violence, is the equivalent of actual violence. They actively campaign for having digital violence recognized as the equivalent of actual violence online. And it's like, it is organizations like this and people in those organizations that are driving a lot of these efforts in the UK, in the EU, in Australia, I'm sure, although I'm not as familiar with the Australian situation. And it does come down to, I fundamentally don't think it's about protecting children for these people. I have 2 children. You have a child. I'm very concerned about how I'm going to control their internet use initially, because I fully intend on doing that. I'm not going to be a sort of laissez-faire parent. But I don't trust the government to particularly help me in doing that initially. I think government has a role to play in the same way, as I said, we spoke about on the podcast before, that take free speech, for example. I wouldn't be like a libertarian on free speech. I would be more European in the sense that I do think there are certain common sense, say, like there are all sorts of like public order provisions for curtailing free speech that Europe has had for decades. Like this is long before, you know, the rise of the EU and things like that. And I think that's good and common sense. And Europe has always been more inclined to sort of limit and regulate things than America has been, say. But the whole point is that I just do not trust the sentiments of sort of, they don't think they're being authoritarian, I'll put it that way, but they are. I mean, and the final thing I'll say on this before letting you back in is that I am seeing an active proliferation of, in the UK, in Australia, in Europe, speech-related incidents that people are being visited by the police for. I feel like 10 years ago, you'd get maybe a couple of these cases a year, and you'd think, gosh, that's crazy, and you'd leave it at that. Whereas I feel like every week now you're seeing the police calling to someone's door in the UK and saying, well, you sent this message in a group chat, or you shared this or that. And it's kind of a difficult thing to keep track of because it's nearly on such a wide scale at this stage. But it wasn't always like this. And I do feel like measures like this, while you could technically say they're neutral, with the sort of prevailing zeitgeist amongst the sort of technical and political elite, you're going to see more of this going further and further. And like, take us being Catholics, I think like we don't believe in gender ideology. We don't believe in any number. I don't believe in same-sex marriage, like things like that. There's a whole load of things that you could say were completely out of step with modern Europe on, that you could easily envision yourself being visited by the police for making comments to that effect online. So
yeah, I agree with all of that. I agree that there's a risk there, but I would say we're talking about a hypothetical risk. What could happen? Here's how this could go wrong. Here's how this could be abused, compared to an actual harm that is observable, that is being done right now.
Well, I would also say it's not a hypothetical concern. I do think these things are happening right now in the places these things are.
Sure, but I mean, like the misuse of age verification is hypothetical. We imagine, you know, here's how this could potentially go wrong, and I'm saying here's how the existing system is going wrong now. You've got young guys. The average age, according to a 2019 study in Ireland, that young males access pornography for the first time was, I believe, 11. And I guarantee you that's the average age. So that means some people are going way younger than that. And that also means that you're probably looking at a significant reduction over the past 6 years, because that study is a few years old. So it's one of those things where I think the current situation is intolerable. And I think that while absolutely there are all of the concerns you raised, I think that if we had like an ideal government, if the current people in the West who are these kind of technocrats were out of power, I think that this sort of a policy would be worth pursuing, and it's something that we should not turn our nose up. I think that a lot of conservatives are afraid of the idea of using government power for anything. If you say the state should regulate this or the state should regulate that, they have a heart attack, because there is like and like, don't get me wrong, I'm not some kind of socialist lunatic who thinks the government should have, like, I would have been much more libertarian when I was younger, and I would have thought, oh yeah, the government should stay out of everything and mind your own business and blah, blah, blah. I'm coming more around to the conclusion that there is a role for the state to regulate things like this, and that it's important that it does so, because, well, you are no doubt going to be a responsible parent, and I know I will be a responsible parent, and many of our viewers, there's also many people who aren't and won't, and in the same way that we wouldn't just allow, you wouldn't just see a kid smoking and be like, well, if you want to let your 8-year-old smoke, that's nothing to do with me, yeah. Similarly, we know that there's 8-year-olds out here running around looking at things that they have no business looking at, and like, something just has to be done about that. That's my view.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I feel like
something radical, by the way. Like, I would take it, if I was in charge, I would take it as seriously as if we had like a mass drug addiction problem among primary school students. Like, it's that serious, because it's on that level of devastation.
I do get that, but I nearly think, well, the solution should maybe be to be more ambitious. Then it should be like, and I feel like you could. So it's not so much to say, yeah, like take that Ed West example. He's just one example. I mean, I've seen a whole load of content being blocked, say, by the UK law in particular online. But why not do something like then, kind of prevent like kids and young people from accessing the internet at all? Say,
there's an argument for that.
I can't remember which country it was. It might have been Australia as well, talking about a smartphone ban. And obviously there's more ways than a smartphone to access the internet. But, and this is where I would be kind of sympathetic, because you could kind of preserve, this is tricky stuff, because again, these are emerging technologies, and I kind of distrust anyone who's completely settled in their views as to what the best approach to these things is. But I do nearly feel it's better to preserve the internet in its current, or maybe even a slightly previous form, where there was kind of less controls, than to head more so in the direction of governments blocking off what can and can't be seen. But you could kind of circumvent that, it seems, somewhat by limiting the opportunities for young people to be on the internet in the first place, by banning smartphones for, like, I don't know, under 16s, under 18s or whatever. Because say under 18s can't buy alcohol. So why not say, well, you can't get a smartphone either. You can have this phone where you can make calls to like your parents and some friends or something like this. But that's literally all you can do on this technology. I do think that there's a much better argument to be made for a kind of tech minimalism than there is for kind of trying to integrate this regulation onto the internet as we have it in a way that affects everyone. And a lot of people would say by design, that's what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I could also undermine my own argument by pointing out that given the level of grotesque propaganda that proliferates within the school system, if kids don't have any access to alternative sources of information, I mean, of course, you're always going to have your parents, but let's say your parents aren't that political, which is the case for a lot of people, then the only source of political values and information you're getting really is from your teacher, who may and probably is a demented left-wing lunatic. So I suppose that's a concern as well, but I don't know. It's all very complex, but I really just wanted to have a fight with you about something, so I figured.
This is the difficulty with both of us being Catholics, because I think a lot of people are like, well, Sarah and John's podcast is more contentious, and that's probably true. But by virtue of the fact that we're both Catholics, we're kind of in alignment on a lot of things value-wise. I mean, the funny thing is, I feel like they're kind of more idiosyncratic things that we disagree a lot about. Like, I find your like efficiency maxing personality just unfathomable. That's one area that we're just like, completely diverging on. But when it comes to, you know, the good and things like that, I think we're both largely in agreement about a lot of these things. Was like, chances are a lot of the things you wouldn't want your son looking at on the internet are things that I wouldn't want my son looking at on the internet either.
Like, for example, I would never want my son to watch the parts of this podcast where you're on the screen.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to put a filter on that only shows you.
Yeah, at the bottom. It's just a one long monologue, like half the length. With that said, speaking of Australia, we might touch on our final topic, which is, of course, a sad topic, which is the story out of Bondi Beach, wherein a number of people were killed in a terrorist attack that took place at a Hanukkah event in Sydney, Australia. A father and son are accused of having shot the place up. One of those attackers is dead, alleged attackers, I should say, and the other one is injured and in critical condition in the hospital. And they were investigated several years prior for having ISIS links.
This is so often the way a lot of people are investigated, you know, ahead of time, and so, well, they're on a watch list, so it's probably the safest place for them, and then sure enough, until they actually do something.
Yeah, it's like The Simpsons Millhouse when he's the night watchman and the building falls down and your man says, I thought you were the night watchman, and he says, yeah, I saw the whole thing. First it started falling over and then it fell over. It's like, so yeah, that's pretty much the authorities. I did hear, I don't know the details of the story, so maybe any Australian residents who are watching this can correct me, but I heard that some guy got deported for like allegedly far-right social media posts or something, and people pointed out that you can get so like the authorities will be on your ass if you say something edgy online, and will get you up out of there in record time, whereas you can be on a terror watch list for years, and they're like, oh, we'll keep an eye on him until something happens. So
monitoring the situation, as they say.
Alleged, as always has to be said, people have not had their day in court, and we want to be responsible journalists, so this is all alleged. But the bottom line is 15 people were killed so far. There are 33 injured. One of the killed was a 10-year-old girl, which is obviously tremendously sad. And so you have people pointing to this as a symptom or a natural outworking of the West's, you know, what people from the Jewish community are saying is the anti-Semitism of the West's attacks on Israel. And then, of course, you have people on the other side who are saying criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic at all, and it's just criticism of a state. And I don't know, this is probably going to be controversial. There's no way to talk about this subject without being controversial, unfortunately, so I'm just going to let it rip, because why not? Like, I saw Simon Harris, for example, posting his condolences and saying, you know, this is terrible. And there were all these people in the comments saying, like, you know, you own this, and don't, you know, you're disgusting, and it's like rhetoric by people like you that has led to this, and blah blah blah. I thought that was really, really unfair. That's my personal view. Like, I do not like, you can say so many critical things about Simon Harris and so many critical things about the Irish government and so on. I do not think that Simon Harris's takes on Israel contributed to a barbecue full of people being shot to death in Sydney, Australia. And I think that I don't know, that just really rubbed me the wrong way. I think Paul Murphy of People Before Profit was getting similar pushback, because he said, this is horrible, there's no place for anti-Semitism, and people were attacking him, like trying to lay responsibility for something like this at his feet. I just think that's, people on both sides of every political issue do this. Whenever if a right-wing lunatic goes on a mass shooting, you'll get left-wingers being like, you're responsible for this. Like, I don't know. I don't even want to name anybody but like, people have nothing to do with anything. And then similarly, like, if a left-winger or a Muslim or somebody, I don't think that that's appropriate or helpful in these situations.
Well, yeah, the great difficulty with this one is that everyone's operating according to different definitions and things. I mean, I do feel like there are a large number of people who are operating according to the assumption that, you know, to criticize Israel is anti-Semitic, and whether they would even profess to that, whether they would say that that's their definition or not, I think is open to question. But it sort of works out that way in the end, where you and I both said on the podcast before, we don't think that it's funny, it's one of the few areas, you got us, coming out and defending the Irish government. I don't think the Irish government is anti-Semitic.
No.
I do think that they have put a questionable degree of focus on Israel since October 7th, 2023. Not questionable, I think entirely disagreeable, to the point that they've been focusing on that, I would nearly say, to the detriment of domestic affairs and things like that. But I don't know how else to take it. When I was listening to RT Radio 1 this morning, and they had a representative of the Australian Jewish community on the radio, and I was largely in agreement with a lot of what she had to say about an actual rise in anti-Semitism, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But she said something that I did find disagreeable, which was that she sort of implicated the government. Then she was sort of saying, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not quoting verbatim because I don't have it in front of me, but she was essentially saying that, the Jewish community in Ireland is very fearful, which I don't doubt is true. She's saying because the government hasn't been sort of supporting them enough and things like that, and essentially, leaving them wide open to the anti-Semitic forces at work. I think sort of the subtle implication possibly there being that the government, because of the positions that it holds and the views that it expresses, doesn't take too much issue with actual anti-Semitism. And I feel the RT presenter, I push back on that. And again, is one of the few areas that I would actually be inclined to agree with the pushback on this point, because I think, well, you did have the Garda Commissioner come out then, and the Gardaí releasing a statement saying they're going to be ramping up security for Jewish events, which I do think they should be doing and things like that. But I think sort of to try and paint the state as, anti-Semitic because it has been at loggerheads with Israel over what's been going on in the Middle East is disingenuous, and it's inaccurate, I would be of the opinion. Now, all of that said, I do think that it's really complicated. I do think that a lot of people profess to being anti-Zionist, they'll say that, they're against the Zionist project, they're against sort of Zionist propaganda and things like that. And I think a lot of the time that does blur over into being, for a lot of people, I think that blurs over into being anti-Semitic, because obviously a lot of the support for Israel has, broad international support, but it obviously has a lot of support from Jews, both actually religious and secular. And so, like, when you hear chants, like, I can't remember who it was a couple of weeks back, one of the Oxford or Cambridge students or something like that, where they're saying, put the Zios in the ground. It's like, it's hard not to view that as being, despite the fact that he's saying Zionist, it's hard not to view that as being anti-Semitic. So I do think that there's a lot of blurred lines here and things like that. But nonetheless, having established that, in my opinion, you can distinguish between being sort of critical of Israel's conduct and policy and things like that and anti-Semitism, I nevertheless do think there's been an uptick in anti-Semitism, because, and you can look at the stats and see this. I mean, there have been soaring rates of attacks on synagogues, attacks on Jews and things like that, particularly in countries that have and this is just an aspect that has to be discussed and can't really be left out of it, that have had very high levels of immigration and things like that. It's notable that, say, France, Germany, the UK have had very high levels of anti-Semitic incidents or increases in anti-Semitic incidents. And so I do think that it is an actual phenomena that has to be considered and can't just be, written off as, they're equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and things like that. I think it's all very messy and all mixes together, but I do think that there's definitely a rise in anti-Semitism at play here. And indeed, they were targeting a Hanukkah event here. It's explicitly well, again, it hasn't gone through the courts and that hasn't all been established on that side yet, but on the face of it, it very much seems to be explicitly anti-Jewish. There's no other way to put it. And I do think that it's wise for governments and security services to be stepping up security in places like Berlin and London and Paris and elsewhere in light of that.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen for years attacks on Christian events, like the Christmas market attacks that are happening in Germany almost every year. It feels like, France, I believe we've seen similar stuff, sure wasn't, I don't know if it was confirmed in the end, but there was a lot of speculation around the Notre Dame burning. That
I
was
don't know if that was ever,
deliberate.
and I don't think there was anything ever confirmed around that, or if there was.
Well, there are a lot of churches around mainland Europe that seem to spontaneously combust for reasons that are.
That's definitely established. There's definitely an uptick in arson attacks against churches and church vandalism incidents.
I mean, something that is very under discussed is that there's even a lot of vandalism against churches in Ireland, and that's something that I would actually be frankly say that the Irish, I don't know, basically I would consider Irish politicians more anti-Christian than they are anti-Jewish in terms of their direct antipathy. Like, I would say there is a substantial number of Irish politicians who actually have like a resentment towards
a visceral disdain for like the Catholic Church, say, or towards the teachings of the church and things like that. Yeah,
if they see some like granny with rosary beads, that they actually have kind of a contemptuous view of them. Yeah. So yeah, none of that is to minimize the suffering and the what has happened to various Jewish communities around the world. And I'm sure that there is a level of radicalism that they are in the crosshairs of. But I think it's just to say that the sort of tribalism that we're seeing emerging in the West, I don't think there's any one group who you can point to as being responsible or at the receiving end of it. Like, it's kind of just a negative trend that we're seeing, I would say, partly as a result of multiculturalism, that you are seeing the kind of balkanization of society and different groups. I mean, we even saw it in the UK with a lot of Muslims and Hindus
facing off in the streets.
Like having these, and you go, that beef is present in the East. We see that between Pakistan and India and in certain areas and the Punjab region, all this kind of thing. Kashmir as well, isn't it? That whole part of the world. And then that doesn't stop once those people come to Britain. Like, just because you've changed their geographical location doesn't mean their deep-seated animosities and problems suddenly vanish overnight. And so as we turn society more and more multicultural, you're just seeing kind of a more and more chemicals being added to the concoction until something explodes. And that's unfortunately what we're witnessing, and it's horrible to say.
Well, this is it. I mean, I think if you want to just sort of state it in a way that I would hope as many people can get behind as possible, is that the levels of immigration the Western world in particular is seen are already, and certainly will continue, they are just going to result in more dynamic environments. And I don't necessarily mean dynamic as a good thing there. Obviously it's often used as, praise for a company or whatever being a dynamic competitor, but more so in the sense that, again, you're talking about the alleged the suspects in this attack, both of whom, so one of the older one, they're a father-son duo, it's believed. The older one, if I'm remembering correctly, had immigrated to Australia in like 1996, 1998 or something like that on a student visa. And then the younger one, his son, was born in Australia, but obviously was a second generation immigrant. And so you could very easily make the case that were Australia much tighter. And it's funny, I haven't read too much about Australia's immigration situation in a while. I had been under the impression for a long time that it was fairly strict in terms of its immigration policy, but clearly, it still isn't stopping things, because you would say, obviously, that if they were much, much stricter, well, this wouldn't have happened. There's obviously a lot of nuance as to how that would work out. But then it's complicated because there's obviously footage going around of a guy who disarmed one of the attackers, and there's a lot of debate over whether he's a Middle Eastern Christian or whether he's a Muslim. But he certainly appears to be from Lebanon or the Middle East. And he wouldn't have disarmed him had he not had he not been in the right place at the right time. And in order for him to be in the right place in the right time, he had to emigrate to Australia.
Well, and I will say as well, like, I saw some people criticizing him because he didn't kill the unarmed assailant. And like, I just want to say, like, first of all, you could argue about the merits or demerits of whether or not he should have done that. And, I think basically, I don't think you should be shooting unarmed people, even wicked people. You know, like that's why we have law and order. But aside from that, let's say he did the wrong thing for the sake of argument, and let's say he should have just finished your man off. The amount of like Mark Wahlberg tier people. I don't know if you remember this comment Mark Wahlberg, the actor, made years ago, where he said, if he was on the 9/11 flight, it wouldn't have gone down like that because he's like built different. Now I'm sure like he was being serious, but I'm sure he regrets that now. Like these are the stupid things that we all like blurt out occasionally. But I always like my wife and I have a running joke about that where like I would have pulled a Mark Wahlberg in that situation. So like don't be going on social media and criticizing a guy who spear tackled a gunman who's currently unloading,
wrestled a gun off of him. Yeah,
like you have no idea. First of all, there's the vast majority of us would not have had the courage to do that. And if you did have the courage to do that, on the very small chance that you had the cojones to pull that off, you have no idea how you would react. Like, I like to think of myself as a man who would, like, if it was going down, I would be there. But you don't, until you are in the crucible of mortal peril, where there's actually bullets flying in your direction and you have no idea how you're going to react, and most of us would just shit our pants and start crying. That's the bottom line, like no matter how tough you think you are. So anyway, I thought it was important to say that because I saw a lot of people like criticizing the way he handled his act of heroic vigilantism. I'm like, who are you going to criticize next? Batman? Like, what are we doing here, you know? So
the only way I could be more petty is if they criticize how he's holding the gun or something like that.
Oh, terrible trigger discipline or something. It's like, okay.
But it just suffice to say, I mean, it's just, gosh, I really cut that out of my vocab. Suffice to say,
people I was thinking of doing a line of shirts. Suffice to say.
But it is just the case that immigration is making society, and I don't cast everything back to immigration. I mean, I kind of get a bit annoyed sometimes about the fact that, like, I sometimes feel like immigration is the new pandemic, in the sense that, you know, the pandemic, massive and disastrous as it was in many ways, obviously I'm talking about government responses here primarily, was, yeah, like I feel like it became totalizing for people in a way that it shouldn't have become totalizing, because, you know, I would ultimately say life is about more than that. And I feel like immigration kind of threatens to become the same thing, and that for a lot of people this is the number one thing happening that has to be responded to. And while it is obviously a very important dynamic changing the nature of the Western world, it's like, well, life ultimately is about more than immigration, or, depending on your persuasion, fostering or combating immigration. But I think nevertheless, you have to be able to acknowledge that this is one of the things that's factoring into things like this happening. It's not to say that, you know, the only anti-Semites in the Western world or across the world are immigrants. I think, you know, prime example probably is Nick Fuentes, who, you know, refers to Hitler as cool and different things like that, and has got a massive following as a result. But nevertheless, that things are changing as a result of sort of many people coming, having different value sets and things like that is clear. I mean, you brought up Christmas markets a while ago, but this Christmas does seem different to me. I don't know whether it's just because I'm paying more attention to the news cycle or what this year, but I mean, I feel like I've seen more like Paris cancelling its New Year's Eve celebrations. I saw German police foiling an attack on a Christmas market again in Germany. They arrested 5 people who I think were Egyptian, Syrian, someone from somewhere else. You've just got sort of Christmas markets. That was just a foil attack. They've cancelled a couple of Christmas markets in Germany because of the threat levels being so high. And it's like, kind of take it as a given that this is just, you know, the way Europe is now. Europe wasn't always this way. This is actually a very recent development, and it is a result of policy choices and decisions that governments have made. And so I do think that I'm kind of expected to continue. I know some people might be annoyed that we kind of shoehorned immigration into this discussion about what happened in Bondi Beach, but I do feel like it's obviously an element that can't be ignored in all of this.
Yeah, I think so. And what else cannot be ignored is the quality of this podcast. And so with that said, we might be doing a future Q&A type episode. We had started off doing questions and answers as a segment, and we're thinking of possibly going back to that. So if you would like to leave a question, you have to be a Gript subscriber, but you can go to gript.ie/questions. The link will be on the screen, so you can go there. And so hopefully we will answer some of your questions on the next episode of the Long Game Podcast, wherever that is. So thank you so much for watching, and God bless.
God bless.